Welcome to Sex Positive Gaming. NTR is probably one of the most controversial flavors in the video game industry. It has die-hard fans and seemingly even more die-hard detractors. For those new to the flavor, I'll link to previous videos where I go more in depth with an explanation. But basically we're talking about a theme where a love interest ends up with another person. Which you would think that was a pretty common experience, as that is basically the result for at least 1/3 of the people in a love triangle. So while this is an incredibly common theme in movies, television, and literature, for some reason this flavor is treated very differently in video games. I'm not sure if that's because of the self-insert nature of the medium, where we are more likely to closely identify with the main character, or what, but the result is that whenever a game with this theme comes out, one of the first questions is the NTR optional? So here are 12 titles where optional NTR is a core aspect of the gameplay experience. First up is Long Story Short. Your best friend's new girlfriend is absolutely gorgeous, and there's also absolutely no way you would ever make a play for her. And what about this naive girl you just met, Anne, and the bartender who was totally into her? The long story short is that Long Story Short is about corruption and choosing how decadent you want this story to be. The animations and renders are great, and the only real drawback is that the builds take forever to come out. But then, aren't disappointment and delayed gratification at the heart of the NTR experience? Long Story Short is available for PC, Mac, Android, and Linux on their Patreon. Our next title, Our Red String, is from the same developer that made Good Girl Gone Bad. You have the same choices as the first game between making dumb decisions and making really, really dumb decisions. It's just that now you have both a male and female protagonist lives to ruin. Corruption, cheating, despair, all await your choices. The art is great and the story is still a fun kind of manic insane. Our Red String is available for PC, Mac, and Android on itch.io and their Patreon. Moving to a more laid-back experience, we have Runaway Princess. You are a farmer in a medieval fantasy world, and your chill peasant lifestyle is upended when a mysterious elf appears unconscious on your farm. Now you are thrust into a journey to leave home. What will happen to your loved ones who come with you and those that stay behind? The renders are decent, and there are some animations, as well as different gameplay mechanics depending on where you are in your journey. Runaway Princess is available for PC and Mac on their Patreon. Sticking with the fantasy vibe, we have A Struggle with Sin. So this game has some pretty poor renders and animations, but the fans of this title swear by the story and relationship mechanics. There are an insane number of pursuable romantic relationships, and almost everyone has some type of corruption and NTR mechanic that can cause them to end up with other characters. Each of these outcomes is preventable and can be seen as a failure to complete various quests before their deadlines. Or you can just completely disable the NTR feature. A Struggle with Sin is available for PC on their Patreon. Next up is another title with an interesting story, but poorer renders and animations. Horton Bay Stories Jake. You are new in town after moving away from a failed romance. Fortunately, all of your new roommates are female. How will you build your new life? Will you let your new roommate's boyfriend take over, or will you break them up? Your actions, or inaction, will cause each character's corruption level to increase over time. Some decisions are more permanent than others, but this game has some really clever cheat mechanics to help undo mistakes, as well as the option to turn off NTR entirely. Horton Bay Stories Jake is available for PC and Mac on their Patreon. So our next title doesn't have a title on Patreon for some reason. You and a group of people are hiding out from the mob, but the mob totally knows where you are anyways, but you're working together to solve this mob-related problem with some type of venture. But you're definitely not a family, so this game is definitely not called a family venture. This is one of those zany comedic adventures where you don't want to ask too many questions about the plot. The renders and animations are great, and you have the choice of how you want the male population of this town to interact with your loved ones. Will you compete? Will you fail? Or will you just turn the NTR feature off completely? Mysterious Unnamed Mob Game is available for PC, Mac, Linux, and Android on their Patreon. In our next game, Babysitters, you play as a husband whose wife has just returned to work after the birth of your child. There are temptations for both of you all around. How will each of you respond? Will you both remain faithful? Will you explore temptation together? Or will one of both of you succumb to desire? The animations and renders are great, even if the development pace is really slow. Babysitters is available for PC, Mac, Linux, and Android on their Patreon. Speaking of slow development pace, our next title is Seeds of Chaos. How slow? Well, development on this dark fantasy adventure began over 6 years ago, and we still haven't seen the completion of the first of 3 planned parts. If Part 1 finishes next year, we are on pace to see this game completed by 2037, which should just be in time for the release of Star Citizen. Until then, the art is awesome, there are some animations, and this is one of the most comprehensive selections of optional flavors in any game, including an incredibly deep web of NTR outcomes for our heroic husband and wife. Seeds of Chaos is available for PC, SteamOS, and Linux on Steam, with Mac and Android versions on itch.io and their Patreon. Where many of the games on this list have had some type of feature to opt out of NTR content, our next title, Secret Care Cafe, requires you to opt in. In this cafe management simulation game, one of the many items that you can buy is a pin. If you buy and present this pin to each of your employees, it will then turn on additional features, activities, and scenes that otherwise do not take place in the game. It is your choice on how many people you give this pin to, or not at all. The animations and renders are about as good as you can get from Koikatsu models. Secret Care Cafe is available for PC on Patreon with an experimental Mac version on itch.io. I've covered our next title, Peasants Quest, in previous videos. This RPG Maker high fantasy adventure gives you the option of whom to pursue, and if others can pursue them as well. This is a longer title with a bunch of quests and characters to discover. The renders and animations are dated, but that is probably because this game has been in development for almost 6 years. Peasants Quest is available for PC, Mac, and Linux on their Patreon. Our next title, Misfits, is a classic 1980s sexual coming-of-age comedic romp. You have the choice of how the girl you are dating interacts with those around you, but you do not have that much control over the other characters in the game. So be prepared for various hijinks from those around you. Think Porky's or Animal House, and you get the idea. The renders and animations are okay, and the plot is actually pretty interesting in how romantic or corrupting the unfolding story you create is. Misfits is available for PC, Mac, Linux, and Android on their Patreon. And finally, we have Taffy Tales. I covered this dark comedy corruption slice of life title last year, and it's probably one of the most popular games with optional NTR. I mean, if you do sexually corrupt a whole town, then there is going to be some implied other activity, but you have the option on whether or not to make it front and center. And you definitely have the option to make it front and center. Whichever you choose. The art and animations are as great as the story is dark. Very dark. Taffy Tales is available for PC, Mac, Linux, and Android on their Patreon. There you have it. Each of these games has its own specific take on the NTR flavor. There is definitely a bias in this genre towards heteronormative-ish male protagonist games. I think that has a lot to do with the reality that this type of dynamic is pretty standard in all other content. For some reason, heterosexual identifying men really like, or really get bent out of shape, by this flavor. Like in women's romance novels, we just call this, romantic conflict. For every winner, there has to be someone who doesn't win. That doesn't automatically make that person a loser. No. Buying Twitter for $44 billion automatically makes you a loser. We all face loss every day. For some, the exploration of loss can be just as fulfilling as the exploration of victory. Until next time, no shaming, just gaming. Thanks to all this month's support on Patreon. I wouldn't have been able to do this without you all.